was, and we are officially live. What was cool was Sven liked my responses. Loose Finn might be one of the more open people to receiving some input and hearing it. And
he's open-minded, no question about that.
And I
he studied pretty widely too.
Yeah, for sure. And I could probably take some pointers from just observation and that at times, man, because he's really good at that. But he asked a good question regarding cannibal trolling and grace on the last Maq Mack, and the response I gave him, and this is the hardest concept for people to really grasp in truth and in full, but it's the best concept to grasp, is that you can simultaneously rebuke an act and give grace at the exact same moment in time. And in fact, that's the only way to pursue the absolute best outcome or most ideal outcome. If you're not doing, don't get me wrong, we all fall short of doing that, but that is the only way, as we talked about last time, to pursue the best outcome because of the.
When you say grace, you mean like you can rebuke and at the same time whom they want to do better. You can hope for the best outcome, even though it's kind of in their hands.
Yeah. So effectively, I would say it's like this. Like I've had to apply this for the last year in a very serious way, and you know the existence of the good in the person, and in this case, it's someone, a group that I've known very well. So I know this goodness exists. So am I going to ignore this goodness for the bad that I'm seeing in front of me? And the answer to that is no. But the only way to get that goodness to come back around is to rebuke the bad and give immediate grace over and over and over again for the bad act, because you're trying. The goal is not always in the moment to punish. The person typically punishes themselves in the moment. The goal is to get them back to a state where they can be discussed or talked to their good place, with the least collateral damage. And so you can't do.
It's kind of like speaking to their better nature, looking for their higher self.
That's exactly it. Yeah, because it does exist. I guess, and that would be, you have to have that awareness. It is true, and everyone should observe it by now, but they don't. Everyone has an inherent goodness to them and very special gifts. I can learn a lot from listening to a homeless person under a bridge. I've talked to them frequently, and I've learned many things. So anyway, yeah, basically,
that's kind of the principle of charity, isn't it?
I guess, yeah. Yeah.
All right, so you want to do an introduction?
Sure. So we called it Maq Mack, a Doctrine of Grace. I was going to attach Paul's dissent to it, but figured that it's loosely aligned, but not directly aligned to it. But a Doctrine of Grace, UPS. You mind summarizing what went on with the UPS situation that we all know about? That was
I think we all know it. I got a picture up here, and the issue wasn't that there was a cop chase, because that happens all the time. And the issue wasn't the cops took out some bad guys, because that happens all the time. The issue was the cops chased down a truck that had been hijacked, and there was actually the driver was still in there. And they didn't try to negotiate, they just shot it up.
Yeah. And
not only did they just shoot it up and kill him, they also got an innocent bystander, some poor guy who was like way over here.
Yeah.
And then there's guys in these cars. Like, they didn't leave.
Yeah.
The cops are just like, drawing. There's a guy in this car, and here's a cop using it as they basically used innocent bystanders as shields on the streets of the city.
This was the most grotesque part of it for me.
Really was. It was super grotesque.
I mean,
you can see in a later scene here, this guy, he decides that he's had enough, and he tries to move, and he ends up like smashing some other car to get out of the way, and there's the cops still using their cars as shields. Like, come on, guys.
Yeah.
This is not Total Recall. This is not Terminator.
Yeah.
The randoms on the street are not just players in a video game that you lost a few points. No, they don't get to come back if they die.
Exactly.
That's the whole world. That's somebody else's, that's their loved one's whole world.
Well, yeah, it's got the ripple effect inside of the world where it has a ripple effect where the waves just go out from this instance where these people made these horrible decisions, horrible choices, and it's a misapplication of what their actual job is. And you see this a lot. I think that I've tried to steer more away from politics lately, but I think as someone who's worked inside of the conservative GOP for Indiana before in the past, this is where conservatives miss it a lot with police. They have this blanket amnesty mentality too often. I'm not saying all the time, but too often, where they're like, well, they're chasing criminals. They're in these bad situations. Well, yeah, they signed up to be police fucking officers. Of course they are. But beyond that, look at all of this. You talked about total recall. They no longer have a grasp of what their job is. Blessed are the peacemakers. You show me where the peacemaking is.
Where's the peaceful part here? Peace officers. Well, I mean, the peace of the grave for some of these people.
Yeah.
Someone that Renee Heather pointed out, those UPS trucks, they got GPS.
Yeah.
And this film that we're looking at, this is a film from a news helicopter.
Yeah.
So it's not like these guys were actually going to. I mean, it's a freaking UPS truck, man. Where are you going to hide with that?
Yeah.
So they have electronic resources. They have airborne resources. News media helicopters. They've helped in these situations before. The guys running those helicopters, most pilots are pretty on board with keeping the peace. They usually help out if they can. They're not resistant to that. And you know what? When you're 700 feet in the sky, you're pretty safe compared to these poor guys on the street getting shot at.
Yeah. What we find right now is really just an environment where people don't have much comprehension for empathy. Forget the lack of empathy. They don't even have it's the lack of comprehension for empathy. What I mean by that is they don't even understand. They can't even see that inside of that UPS truck is not just the two people they're after, but also another person with a family. And they don't see walking up to the cars, not their own police cars, that this is another person with a family. It's a lack of comprehension of empathy. Forget the lack of empathy. There's one layer, and that's a lot. That's not just police officers. And I think that goes to the problem. And you mentioned total recall. Maybe the gamification of it. Maybe we went over the prescriptions a couple of months ago, how the pharmacology has messed up with people's brains. Maybe a blend of all of that, but there's definitely a total recall mentality out there.
Or, and I hesitate to say this because the research says it's not valid, but it makes you think of the video games again. Like, have these guys just been training to the point where they hardly even think about it?
Well, the numbers don't go to that because you're not going to have a wide enough pool to be able to. You might in a few more years, but it's the desensitization overall, and video games certainly play a role in that, but more so pharmacology. Me and you talked about that. It shuts off the processing centers, so these people don't have the emotional processing centers for months on end. So this pharmacology hits and basically hijacks their brain and makes it function in a different way. And many of the police officers and many people in general are on these kind of antidepressants and anti-anxiety because of the anxious and depressive profession they're in. So that plays a major role. And that you have that kind of mentality, then you're around it all day. So you're around the conflict without the functionality of your brain to have conflict resolution going on.
Desensitization.
Yeah. And
you mentioned just a second ago the de-escalation. Like it's weird. It's weird that this has been a change lately, but the cops have moved. There's a lot of police forces, a lot of police departments that they don't train these guys right. We got training issues where they don't think in terms of de-escalating and mollifying and arresting. They think in terms of subduing, and there's a little bit of that going on.
Stick with the total recall analogy because you have it exactly right. they view it as mission complete, level 1. In other words, they got to shoot these tires out, mission complete. They got to get this guy out, mission complete. You get what I'm saying? They're very mission oriented in a sense of focused on accomplishing this thing in front of them without the purview, the perspective of everything else happening around them. They're very isolated on that environment of the criminal.
There's that, the blinders, the tunnel vision.
Yeah, exactly. And it crept in on a core level for, I would say, not just for the profession of the police force at times, but also in society and handling issues with the police, because you see a lot of conflicts just escalate with the police when an officer is trying to de-escalate the other way around too. So I think that,
what this reminds me of a little bit is Waco.
Yeah.
Or Ruby Ridge. Like this
on a more clearly on a larger scale here, but yeah, absolutely.
Ruby Ridge was like what, 1991, I think.
Yeah, you have that same mindset back and forth, that tension.
The sense that the citizenry are the enemy.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the sense that the citizenry is the enemy, and also the sense of the citizenry from the police to the police officers that they are the enemy. Here's something that I would say everyone needs to really consider on both sides of it. Who is the enemy? and essentially, when you look at the police officer going home to a family and the person he's pulling over going home to a family 90% of the time, they're both on the same team and they just think they're fighting against each other. And that requires a reevaluation of what your objective is. And that's obviously something that needs to happen. But
well, I gotta assume, and I think, as I've been reading some of the things that the police have been saying, they took the attitude that this had to be done to prevent further harm.
So this is something I think that we're going to talk about the doctrine of grace here in a minute. This is why the doctrine of grace is at times so critical.
What?
Well, right now we're getting these very cookie cutter. Look, I could take the statements that are coming out right now from this police department and put them in another questionable, conflicting, open fire situation from another department, and it's going to almost sound exactly the same because of the fact that people have this notion of self-protection over truth right now. So, instead of, I guarantee you actually, because I know police officers, that there's at least one officer involved in that shootout who is very, very conflicted right now. But they're not allowed to go and truly say something because of the self-protective layer the entire department has around it, the self-protective layer this has around it.
Safety versus truth sounds an awful lot like safety versus liberty.
No, absolutely. Yeah. And that's
one of the things that comes out. As I'm reading these reports, the cops said that the pattern here, or the events that occurred, there was apparently a break-in at a jewelry store. There was a silent alarm. It was like 90 seconds later that another cop showed up. And apparently, according to the police reports, of course, all the guys in the truck are dead, so we don't know. There was shots fired back at the jewelry store. But now with these events, you got to, how can you be sure? How do you know it's not just another example of a cop throwing weapons down to try and exonerate their bad behavior?
Well, yeah. So here's how I handled that personally, because you're exactly right. You never know. And right now, the way the structure is set up, you have every right to believe either option in a whole at any given time. I just like to grade what happened. And if I just grade what happened here, you see the fundamental flaw is already there, whether they drop something to frame someone or not, because already they're framing the situation to be to their favor. So they're framing it, we had to do this because
and that's the point. If they hadn't used human shields,
right,
if they had got some innocent bystanders, there'd be no motive to lie.
Right. And so, you're exactly right. But so what you already have is a bad process. And that's where, from a mission perspective process to a process oriented, I'll tell a quick analogy on it. A person I trained in financial sales early, I had two early on. One of them is like leading the state I live in, from the she's the head of a millennial board and she had to go through her experience and actually, go through multiple tries with the Fed. This other person just went skyrocketing through the Fed. First person I hired, trained them both. Basically, I kept on trying to tell them that it was process oriented. You might have good months, bad months, but if you care about the person and less about the end goal, you're going to make a shit ton of money. If you care about the end goal, not about the person, you won't make shit. The guy who had the master's degree and the guy who passed the Fed with all this quickness, he got fired the first week because he thought I was bullshitting when I said that. And the girl I gave you all the accolades on, the young lady, she ended up doing all of that despite her early initial failures because she was process oriented. The police department and in general people have gotten away from being about the process and more about being about the result. They become judgmental. They become cynical. They become skeptical. They become conspiratorial. And then the conspiracy becomes true. Everyone's hiding things because no one can be honest. No one can be, and that's where the doctrine of grace comes in. Because if you have the doctrine of grace, people have more freedom to be honest within their flaws.
That what you described is exactly right. Waco, part of the issue was they kind of lied in wait for David Koresh to try and deal with them. They did the same thing with Ruby Ridge. There was some planting. There was some entrapment going on, planting weapons on this guy, or like one of his buddies who was in the FBI was trying to sell a weapon as a way to get something on him so he can go raid this guy's house. So I got this quote from Ephesians. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness, against spiritual wickedness in high places. I just want to highlight something real quick because for example, when they say powers, right, we're talking about like the powers that the police have, these sort of entitlements that they're given. It's not really about the individual cop. I mean, maybe particular cops if they didn't have these issues, but this is not a one guy thing.
Well, right after power, you're exactly right. This is not this is what people don't realize, and this is where he who can humble themselves can be exalted. Basically, if you realize that you're capable of being Nazi, so like if you look at yourself and like if I was in the worst possible position, would I be capable of being this horrible a person? You should be able to find a pathway in your brain to where you could objectively find yourself getting to that horrible result of yourself because it's possible. And if you can do that, then you realize
that's why Hannah described the banality of evil, because it's not something supernatural. It's something that anybody can do. With the right incentives, whole societies become like that. People say, how can it happen like that? It's because they let certain things go.
I guess it depends on, you're right. So they let certain things go. And I guess it depends on what I think maybe on the highest level, you might call it supernatural, but that would be spiritual wickedness. But beyond that, when you hit the powers, and then right after the powers against rulers of the darkness of the world. So essentially, both of those statements are exactly what you're referencing. You're talking about government power, government force, the processes, that the policies that are going on. See, people forget that we actually should be the authors of the police policy book. This is a government-funded force. If we're going to have a police force, we should be able to rewrite the policies and amend them when situations like this happen, not through these bureaucratic structures set up by what I would call the spiritual wickedness in high places, the darkness of the world, the powers and the principalities. You know what I mean? It's never about the individual flesh and blood. Those are vessels.
No, it's not. And when we talk about the darkness of the spiritual wickedness, I think that's really, the nature of the beast.
Yeah.
I mean, the back end of your brain.
Yeah, the level of conscientiousness that you choose, exactly. So if you're not living in the intentionality part of your brain and really being humble with that part of your brain, then you're likely going to bake into conditioned negative behaviors. You might be rewarded for those negative behaviors, but over time they're going to do you harm and other people harm. And so yeah, and maybe that would be the back of the brain component of it there too. So
well, the back of the brain is the conditioning, right? Which is the stimulus response without a thought in between. All right, so let's talk about what could have happened differently.